April 10th, 1963, 9:13 a.m., 220 miles east of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Depth: approximately 1,300 feet beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. Inside the engine room of the most advanced nuclear submarine ever built, a sound no sailor ever wants to hear suddenly ripped through the silence. A high-pitched shriek of pressurized seawater tearing through a ruptured pipe joint, blasting into the compartment at hundreds of pounds per square inch. The spray was so violent it hit the opposite bulkhead like shrapnel. Within seconds, salt water found the electrical panels. Sparks erupted, circuit breakers tripped, and then the lights went out. In the pitch-black darkness of a flooding engine room, more than 1,000 feet beneath the ocean's surface, the men stationed there had exactly one decision to make. And they had less than 60 seconds to make it. Every manual ever written for this class of submarine said the same thing. When flooding is uncontrollable, surface immediately. Blow all ballast. Drive the boat up. Get to air. Get to sunlight. Get to life. But surfacing required the reactor. The reactor required the electrical bus. And the electrical bus was drowning in salt water right in front of them. There was only one other option, one action that might give the 118 men in the other compartments a chance. Seal the watertight door. Close the engine room off from the rest of the submarine. Trap the flooding inside this one space, and trap yourself along with it. That decision was made, and what followed became the worst submarine disaster in United States Navy history. But before we go any further, if this story grips you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, tap the like button, turn on notifications. Stories like this one deserve to be told, and your support helps us reach more people who need to hear them. Now, let's go back to the beginning. To understand what happened inside the USS Thresher on that April morning, you need to understand the world that built her. It was 1961, the peak of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a deadly contest that played out not just in the skies and in space, but deep beneath the surface of the ocean. Nuclear submarines had become the ultimate weapons. Invisible, undetectable, capable of carrying enough firepower to end civilization. And both superpowers were racing to build them faster, quieter, and deeper diving than anything that had come before. The USS Thresher was America's answer to that challenge. Hull number SSN 5093, the lead boat of an entirely new class of nuclear-powered attack submarines. She was built at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine, and from the moment her keel was laid on May 28, 1958, she was designed to be revolutionary. Thresher wasn't just another submarine. She was the future of undersea warfare. Her hull was constructed from HY-80 steel, a high-yield alloy that could withstand pressures at depths no American submarine had ever reached. Her test depth was 1,300 feet, deeper than any operational U.S. submarine before her. She carried a massive bow-mounted sonar sphere, the most advanced underwater detection system ever devised, capable of picking up enemy submarines at ranges that were, at the time, classified. Her torpedo tubes were moved from the traditional bow position to amidships, angled outward, making room for that enormous sonar array. She was equipped with Subrock, a nuclear-tipped anti-submarine missile that could be launched from underwater. And her engineering spaces featured turbines mounted on sound isolation rafts, making her one of the quietest submarines in the world. At 33 knots submerged, she could outrun almost anything beneath the waves. At 278 feet long and displacing over 4,000 tons submerged, she was a weapon of extraordinary capability. The Navy considered her the crown jewel of the fleet. But here's what almost nobody talked about at the time, what nobody wanted to talk about. The Thresher was also a product of the arms race's most dangerous quality, speed. The pressure to get her built, get her tested, and get her deployed was immense. The Soviets had launched their first nuclear submarine in 1958. Every month that passed without an American counter was a month the gap could widen. And in that rush, corners were cut. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but in the way that pressure always erodes perfection. Small compromises, acceptable risks, the kind of decisions that seem reasonable in a conference room but become catastrophic 1,000 feet underwater. And there was one compromise that would matter more than all the others combined. Throughout Thresher's piping systems, particularly in the saltwater lines that ran through the engine room, many joints were connected not by welding, but by silver brazing. Welding fuses two pieces of metal directly together by melting them at their junction. It creates an incredibly strong bond. Silver brazing is different. It uses a silver alloy as a kind of adhesive, a filler that flows between two pieces of metal to glue them together. It's faster, it's cheaper, and under normal conditions it works just fine. But under the crushing pressures at 1,300 feet, under the thermal stresses of a nuclear submarine's constant heating and cooling cycles, silver-brazed joints could fail. And on Thresher, there were hundreds of them. What the Navy didn't fully appreciate at the time was that a significant percentage of those joints had never been properly inspected. The ultrasonic testing equipment available in the early 1960s couldn't reliably evaluate silver-brazed connections. So many of them were certified based on visual inspection alone, looking at the outside of a joint and declaring it sound, which is a bit like checking if a bridge is safe by admiring the paint job. But that wasn't the only vulnerability hiding inside Thresher's hull. There was another one. one that would seal her fate even more certainly than the piping. The submarine's emergency main ballast tank blow system, the system designed to rapidly expel water from the ballast tanks and rocket the submarine to the surface in an emergency, had a critical design flaw. The high-pressure air lines that fed into the ballast tanks passed through small strainers, mesh filters designed to catch debris before it could damage the reducing valves. These strainers were fine under normal conditions, but at extreme depths, the rapid expansion of compressed air caused temperatures to plummet. If there was any moisture in the airlines, and there was almost always some moisture, that moisture would freeze. Ice would form on the strainers, and ice on a strainer does the same thing as a plug in a pipe. It blocks the airflow completely. The Thresher's crew had no way to blow ballast if the strainers froze, and no one had tested the system under the exact conditions of a deep dive emergency. Not once. This was the knife edge on which 129 lives were balanced. A submarine with questionable pipe joints and an emergency system that might not work when it was needed most. And the man who would command her through her final hours had only been aboard for 3 months. Lieutenant Commander John Wesley Harvey took command of the USS Thresher in January of 1963. He was 35 years old, born in the Bronx, raised in Philadelphia. An honor student at Frankfort High School, where he played varsity football and baseball. He'd earned a scholarship to the University of Pennsylvania before receiving an appointment to the United States Naval Academy, where he graduated in 1950. Harvey was the kind of officer the Navy builds careers around. Smart, disciplined, driven. After serving on the aircraft carrier Coral Sea, he volunteered for submarine duty and graduated third in his class from submarine school. His credentials were extraordinary. He'd served 3 years aboard the USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear submarine, and participated in 2 Arctic cruises, including the historic first submerged transit of the North Pole. He'd been the chief engineer of a nuclear reactor prototype. He'd commissioned the USS Tullabee as engineering officer. He'd served as executive officer on the USS Sea Dragon and participated in the legendary rendezvous with USS Skate at the North Pole in 1962. Harvey understood nuclear submarines at the deepest possible level, both as a commander and as an engineer. But when he arrived at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard to take command of Thresher, what he found was a submarine that had been in overhaul for 9 months and a crew that had been scattered across training facilities and temporary assignments. The boat had undergone her post-shakedown availability, a comprehensive maintenance period designed to fix issues discovered during initial sea trials. Thousands of work orders had been completed. Systems had been torn apart and rebuilt. New equipment had been installed. And Harvey had to take all of these changes and modifications and repairs, and make it ready for sea in a matter of weeks. He had no time to verify every pipe joint. No time to test every system under operational conditions. The sea trial schedule was set. The Navy was waiting, and the party to celebrate the 63rd anniversary of the U.S. Navy submarine force was planned for Thursday night. They just had to get through the deep dive first. But what Harvey didn't know, what no one aboard could have known, was that during the overhaul, the quality of workmanship on certain piping joints had been inconsistent. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard actually had evidence of this. A full year earlier, the submarine USS Barbell had suffered a silver braze joint failure at 600 feet. Causing significant flooding. The warning signs were there. They just weren't connected to the decisions being made about Thresher. On the morning of Tuesday, April 9th, 1963, the day before the disaster, 3 red tugboats nuzzled up against the dew-covered hull of the USS Thresher at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. It was 8 a.m. The crew had been aboard since before dawn, running through pre-departure checklists, checking systems, securing equipment. The nuclear reactor had been brought to criticality at 2 in the morning, and by 7:30, the engine room reported full power available. On the pier, in parked cars, the families had gathered. It was a ritual as old as the submarine force itself. Wives sitting behind the wheel, children in the back seat, noses pressed to windows. As the tugboats began to pull Thresher away from the pier, they communicated with sharp blasts of their whistles. And the children, delighted by the noise, pointed and giggled while their mothers honked their car horns in response. It was playful. It was innocent. It was the last time many of those children would see their fathers alive. On board Thresher that morning were 129 souls, 16 officers, 96 enlisted men, and 17 civilians, a mix of shipyard employees and contractor representatives who were aboard to observe the sea trials and verify that the overhaul work had been completed properly. Among them were engineers, electricians, technicians, men who had spent months crawling through Thresher's compartments and who now wanted to see their work perform under pressure. Literally, 4 crew members had remained ashore for various reasons. One had a family emergency, another was ill, small twists of fate that would become enormous later. As Thresher headed south from the shipyard and into the open sea, she conducted several shallow test dives. These were routine procedures, designed to verify that hatches were sealed, systems were functioning, and the crew was operating smoothly after 9 months out of the water. Every dive went perfectly. The boat responded well, the crew performed well. Confidence was high. By late afternoon, Thresher rendezvoused with her escort ship, the USS Skylark, a submarine rescue vessel that would accompany her to the dive point. Skylark was a 205-foot surface ship equipped with divers, specialized rescue equipment, and an underwater telephone system called the UQC, which allowed voice communication between a submerged submarine and a surface vessel. Skylark's job was simple: stay overhead, maintain communication, and be ready to respond if anything went wrong. Throughout the evening of April 9th, Thresher and Skylark transited southeast toward the dive point, 220 miles east of Cape Cod, where the continental shelf drops away and the ocean floor plunges to 8,400 feet. This was the deep water they needed. If Thresher was going to test her limits at 1,300 feet, she needed to be far from any underwater terrain that might interfere. That night, as the submarine cut through the dark Atlantic, the crew settled into their routines. Men wrote letters, played cards, read paperback novels in their bunks. In the engine room, the watch section monitored the reactor plant, the steady hum of the turbines a constant companion. In the control room, the navigation team tracked their course on charts, marking the miles as they clicked by. Lieutenant Commander Harvey reviewed the sea trial agenda one final time. The plan called for a 2-hour deep dive, descending in 100-foot increments, pausing at each level to check for leaks, cycle valves, and test critical equipment. This was the protocol established by Admiral Hyman Rickover himself, the father of the nuclear navy, who had personally ridden Thresher during her first deep dive after construction and had insisted on these careful, methodical stops. But Harvey's plan was ambitious. The number of checks required at each depth, combined with the time needed to descend and ascend, meant the schedule was tight, very tight. There wouldn't be much margin for delays or complications. And in the submarine business, there are always complications. By dawn on April 10th, Thresher had reached the dive point. The weather on the surface was typical for the North Atlantic in April. Gray skies, cold wind, the ocean was dark and restless with a moderate chop that made Skylark roll uncomfortably at the surface. But below, where Thresher was preparing to operate, the water was calm, cold, and utterly black. At approximately 7:47 a.m., Thresher began her descent. The dive started normally. Harvey ordered the boat down in controlled increments. At each depth, the control room phone talker polled every compartment via the sound-powered telephone circuit. This was a simple but vital system. An officer or enlisted man in each compartment would check for leaks, unusual sounds, or abnormal readings, then report back to the control room. All compartments satisfactory. No problems noted. Continue the dive. As Thresher went deeper, the ocean made its presence known. The hull compressed under the increasing pressure, and the familiar sounds of a deep dive filled the boat, popping, creaking, groaning. The metallic protests of steel being squeezed by millions of tons of water. For experienced submariners, these sounds were normal, even expected. For the civilian riders aboard, some of whom had never been on a deep dive, they were unnerving. At each 100-foot increment, Harvey paused. The checks were conducted. Reports came back clean. The boat was performing. At 400 feet, satisfactory. At 650 feet, satisfactory. At 1,000 feet, satisfactory. Thresher was holding up. Her new HY-80 hull was doing exactly what it was designed to do. At approximately 8:53 a.m., a Thresher reported to Skylark that she had reached a depth of approximately 1,000 feet, which was 300 feet above test depth, and that she was continuing the descent to test depth of 1,300 feet. And then something changed. What happened next has been the subject of debate, investigation, and classified analysis for over 60 years. The exact sequence of events inside Thresher during the next 25 minutes will never be known with absolute certainty, because no one survived to describe them. But based on the Navy's Court of Inquiry, the analysis of SOSUS acoustic data, declassified documents, and the testimony of 120 witnesses, the following is the most probable reconstruction of those final minutes. Sometime between 8:53 and 9:10 a.m., as Thresher approached or reached her test depth of 1,300 feet, a silver-brazed piping joint in the engine room's saltwater system failed. The failure was sudden. At 1,300 feet, the sea pressure is approximately 580 pounds per square inch. When a pipe joint fails at that pressure, the water doesn't leak. It doesn't drip. It explodes inward with the force of a fire hose amplified beyond imagination. A jet of freezing seawater, propelled by 1,000 pounds of pressure, tore into the engine room. The spray was immediate and devastating. It hit everything. It hit the electrical panels. It hit the control systems. It hit the men standing watch. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being in a sealed steel room the size of a modest living room, more than a quarter mile below the surface of the ocean, and suddenly the room begins to fill with water at a rate you can't control and can't stop. The water is 35 degrees Fahrenheit. It hits your skin like needles of ice. The noise is deafening. You can't see, you can't hear, you can barely think, and you have seconds to act. In the engine room, the engineering watch section would have immediately recognized what was happening. These were trained nuclear submarine sailors. They knew the sounds of their boat the way a musician knows their instrument. A pipe failure at depth was one of the scenarios they trained for, but training for it and experiencing it are two very different things. The standard procedure for a flooding casualty was clear. Isolate the leak. Find the ruptured pipe and close the nearest valve upstream and downstream. Cut off the water at its source. But here's where Thresher's design became a death trap. The layout of the engine room, with its tightly packed equipment and maze of piping, meant that the isolation valves for many of the saltwater systems were not easily accessible. Some were behind equipment. Some required tools. Some could only be reached by climbing through spaces that were now being hammered by jets of seawater. The Court of Inquiry would later determine that the crew was, in their words, unable to quickly access vital equipment to control the flooding. They tried. Of that, there is no doubt. These men tried with everything they had. But the water was winning, and then the salt water hit the electrical bus. The main electrical bus was the heart of Thresher's power distribution system. It connected the nuclear reactor's steam-driven generators to every electrical system on the boat. Lighting, navigation, fire control, and most critically, the reactor's own control systems. When saltwater spray reached the electrical panels, the effect was instantaneous. Short circuits cascaded through the system, circuit breakers tripped in rapid succession, and the reactor, sensing abnormal electrical conditions, did exactly what it was designed to do. It scrammed. A scram is an emergency shutdown of a nuclear reactor. Control rods are driven into the reactor core, absorbing neutrons and stopping the nuclear chain reaction. It happens in milliseconds. It's a safety feature designed to prevent a runaway reaction. Under normal circumstances, a scram is a good thing. It protects the crew from a much worse scenario. But 1,300 feet below the surface, with water flooding the engine room, a scram was a death sentence. Here's why. When the reactor scrammed, the nuclear chain reaction stopped. That meant the reactor stopped producing heat. Without heat, the steam generators couldn't produce steam. Without steam, the turbines couldn't turn. Without the turbines, two things disappeared simultaneously: propulsion and electrical power. The submarine lost its ability to drive itself to the surface, and it lost the power needed to operate most of its systems. The lights went out, the electronics went dark, the boat went silent. And there was more. Under the operating procedures of 1963, a reactor scram required the crew to immediately isolate the main steam system. This was done to prevent an overly rapid cool down of the reactor, which could damage the fuel elements. It was a procedure developed in peacetime, optimized for reactor safety, not for survival at depth. But it meant that even the residual steam in the secondary system, the steam already generated before the scram, couldn't be used to power the turbines. It was deliberately cut off. The crew followed the book, as they were trained to do, and the book killed them. At 9:13 a.m., USS Skylark received a garbled transmission over the underwater telephone. The voice was distorted, broken by the acoustic conditions and the depth. But the words, partially reconstructed by multiple listeners aboard Skylark and later analyzed by the Court of Inquiry, were these: experiencing minor difficulties. Have positive up angle. Attempting to blow? Yes, minor difficulties. The language of a Navy trained to understate everything. The previous commanding officer of Thresher would later testify that he would never have described flooding, even from a small diameter pipe, as minor. The fact that Harvey used those words tells us either that the initial flooding appeared controllable, or that Harvey, standing in the control room, didn't yet fully understand the severity of what was happening in the engine room behind the sealed, watertight door. Have positive up angle. The bow was pointed upward. The boat was trying to climb. But without propulsion, an up angle means nothing. You can point a submarine's nose at the sky, but if you have no power to drive it forward and up, physics wins, the boat simply hangs there, then begins to sink. Attempting to blow, this was the critical moment. Harvey had ordered the emergency main ballast tank blow. This was the last resort, the nuclear option of submarine survival. High-pressure air, stored in steel flasks throughout the boat, would be released into the main ballast tanks, forcing out the seawater inside them and creating enough buoyancy to launch the submarine toward the surface. In theory, it was simple. In theory, it was reliable. But Thresher's blow system was neither. When the high-pressure air valves opened, the compressed air began rushing through the piping toward the ballast tanks. As it expanded from its storage pressure of 4,500 pounds per square inch down through reducing valves to the working pressure of 3,000 pounds per square inch, the temperature plummeted. Moisture in the airlines, moisture that was always present because no dehumidification system could remove it completely, began to freeze. Ice crystals formed on the wire mesh strainers upstream of the reducing valves. In seconds, those strainers were blocked, plugged solid with ice. The air couldn't get through. The men in the control room would have heard the initial rush of air, felt the brief surge of hope as the blow system activated, and then they would have heard it fade, dwindle, stop. The gauges in the control room, if any were still functioning on emergency power, would have shown what was happening. Ballast tank pressure wasn't rising. The water wasn't being pushed out. The system had failed. Thresher's sister ship, USS Thresher, which was still under construction at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard when Thresher was lost, was asked by the Court of Inquiry to test her own ballast blow system shortly after the disaster. When Thresher's crew activated the system, it failed in exactly the same way. The strainers collapsed and blocked, clogged with ice. When they pulled the strainers out and examined them, the physical evidence was unmistakable. The design was flawed. Every submarine of this class had the same vulnerability. Thresher was just the first to discover it, and she discovered it at the worst possible moment. Now, let's go back to that engine room, because this is where the story that the title of this video describes took place. And it's a story that deserves to be told with the gravity it carries. When the pipe joint failed and the flooding began, the men in the engine room had a choice. The watertight door connecting the engine room to the forward compartments could be left open, allowing the flooding to spread through the submarine, but also allowing the engine room crew to escape forward. Or it could be sealed, trapping the flooding in one compartment and trapping the men inside with it. On nuclear submarines, watertight doors between compartments are designed to be sealed during flooding to preserve the integrity of the rest of the boat. The principle is simple and brutal. Sacrifice the flooded space to save the ship. If the flooding can be contained in one compartment, the submarine retains enough buoyancy in its other compartments to survive, at least in theory. But sealing a watertight door from inside a flooding compartment is not an abstract decision made by a committee in a warm, dry conference room. It's a decision made by a human being, standing in freezing water in total darkness, knowing full well what sealing that door means. It means you stay. You stay with the water. You stay with the cold. You stay with the noise and the darkness and the terror. And you hope, you pray, that by staying, you've given the men on the other side of that door a chance. Based on the evidence gathered by the Court of Inquiry, the engineering watch section in Thresher's engine room took exactly that action. They sealed themselves in. They chose to contain the flooding at the cost of their own lives, believing that if they could keep the water in the engine room, the rest of the crew, approximately 118 men in the forward compartments, might be able to surface the boat. It was an act of extraordinary courage, an act that followed every principle of submarine damage control, an act consistent with the deepest traditions of the naval service. And it wasn't enough. Because even with the engine room sealed, the reactor had already scrammed. The power was already gone. The blow system was already frozen. The 118 men forward were alive, but they were trapped in a submarine that was sinking, without propulsion and without the ability to blow ballast. They had emergency battery power, but the battery on a nuclear submarine is small, designed only to power essential systems for a short period. It couldn't drive the boat to the surface. At approximately 9:15 a.m., Skylark received another transmission from Thresher. This one was even more garbled than the first. Most of it was unintelligible, but one fragment came through clearly enough to be understood. A number 900. Acoustic analyst Bruce Rule, who spent over 42 years with the Office of Naval Intelligence and later published his own analysis based on declassified SOSUS data, interpreted this as a reference to depth. He believed Thresher was reporting that she was 900 feet below her test depth. If he's correct, that means that at approximately 9:15 a.m., Thresher was at approximately 2,200 feet, nearly 1,000 feet deeper than she was designed to go. She was falling, sinking, and there was nothing anyone aboard could do to stop it. At 9:16 a.m., Skylark received one final transmission. It was almost completely garbled, but one phrase was recovered: exceeding test depth. The word exceeding was not entirely clear. Some listeners thought it might have been passing, but the meaning was the same. Thresher had gone beyond her design limits. She was in territory where no submarine of her class had ever been, and the ocean was crushing her. At 9:18 a.m. and 24 seconds, the hydrophones of the SOSUS array and the sonar operators aboard Skylark recorded a sound that would haunt the submarine community for generations. It was described as a dull, muted thud, like a compartment collapsing, like air rushing into a tank. The sound of a submarine's hull giving way to the ocean. The implosion happened in 1/10 of a second. That's faster than a human nerve can transmit a pain signal to the brain. At a depth of approximately 2,400 feet, 400 feet below her predicted collapse depth, the pressure hull of the USS Thresher failed catastrophically. The hull sections collapsed inward at supersonic speed. The air inside was compressed to a fraction of its volume in an instant. Everything inside, every piece of equipment, every instrument, every human body, was destroyed in a moment too brief for the nervous system to register. They felt nothing. That is, perhaps, the only mercy in this entire story. USS Skylark's crew heard the sound and knew. They knew it in their bones, the way submariners know these things. The commanding officer of Skylark began sending emergency signals and started a close area search, but there was no hope, not anymore. At 10:58 a.m., nearly 2 hours after the implosion, Skylark's crew began dropping small explosive grenades into the water. This was a standard signal used to tell a submarine that surface contact had been lost, and to either check in via the underwater telephone or surface. The grenades detonated with sharp, concussive blasts that traveled for miles through the water. There was no response. There would never be a response. By early afternoon, Commander Submarine Flotilla 2 in New London, Connecticut, received the message that contact with Thresher had been lost and a search was underway. The news began its terrible journey up the chain of command. Naval installations along the entire East Coast were ordered to mobilize search assets. The submarine USS Seawolf and the submarine rescue ship USS Sunbird were diverted to the area. Every ship within 100 miles was alerted. But on shore, in the small homes and apartments near the naval bases, the families still didn't know. The wives who had honked their horns on the pier the morning before, the children who had waved. They were going about their Wednesday, planning for Easter, which was just 4 days away, preparing Easter egg hunts, buying ham for the holiday dinner, expecting their husbands and fathers home by Thursday in time for the party. At 6:30 p.m. on April 10th, the commander of Submarine Force Atlantic sent word to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard to begin notifying the families. The first call was to Irene Harvey, wife of the commanding officer. The protocol was specific. A chaplain and a senior officer would visit each home in person. The knocks on the doors began that evening and continued through the night. 129 families, 129 front doors, 129 moments where a life split in two, before the knock and after. That same evening, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral George W. Anderson, Jr. stood before the press corps at the Pentagon and announced what the Navy had spent all day hoping wasn't true. The USS Thresher was lost with all hands. President John F. Kennedy ordered all flags to be flown at half-staff from April 12th through April 15th in honor of the 129 men who had perished. Executive Order 11-104 was issued, paying tribute to the crew. The nation mourned, but the mourning was accompanied by something else, something that began almost immediately and would grow more intense with each passing week. Questions, demands for answers. How could this have happened? How could the most advanced submarine in the world, crewed by some of the most experienced submariners in the Navy, be lost on a routine test dive? What went wrong? Who was responsible? Vice Admiral Bernard L. Austin, the president of the Naval War College and himself a veteran submariner, was named president of the Court of Inquiry. He was assisted by 4 other senior officers, including former submarine commanders and engineering specialists. The court convened at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, within sight of the pier where Thresher had departed just days before. Over the next 8 weeks, the court heard testimony from 120 witnesses. They compiled 1,700 pages of testimony. They gathered 255 exhibits, charts, drawings, letters, photographs, construction records, maintenance logs, and debris recovered from the ocean floor. They examined every minute detail of Thresher's design, construction, and overhaul. They interviewed the shipyard workers who had repaired her, the contractors who had inspected her, the engineers who had designed her, the officers who had commanded her before Harvey. The investigation was the most thorough the Navy had ever conducted into the loss of a submarine, and its conclusions were devastating. The court determined that the most probable cause of the loss was a flooding casualty in the engine room, caused by the failure of one or more silver-brazed piping joints in a saltwater system. The flooding led to saltwater spray on electrical components, which caused short circuits that triggered the reactor scram. The loss of propulsion power meant the submarine could not drive itself to the surface. And the emergency main ballast tank blow system failed to operate properly because of ice formation in the strainers of the high-pressure air piping. But the court went further. It found that the responsibility could not be placed on any single individual or organization. Instead, it was a cascade of collective failures, inadequate quality assurance during construction and overhaul, insufficient testing of critical safety systems under realistic conditions, training gaps that left the crew unprepared for the specific combination of failures they faced, deviations from design specifications during the overhaul, a lack of clear communication between the shipyard, the design bureaus, and the submarine force about known vulnerabilities. In other words, the system failed. Not one person, not one decision. The system, the network of organizations and procedures and assumptions that together were supposed to ensure that a submarine like Thresher could survive the situations she was designed to face. That system had gaps, and those gaps killed 129 people. The physical search for Thresher began immediately after the loss and would continue for months. The Navy deployed every deep water asset it had. The Bathyscaphe Trieste II, the deepest diving vessel in the world, was brought to the site. Research vessels with specialized sonar and deep-towed camera systems scoured the ocean floor at 8,400 feet. What they found was heartbreaking. Thresher had been torn apart. Her remains lay scattered across the ocean floor in 6 major sections, spread over a debris field covering roughly 33 acres. The hull had been shattered by the implosion and the subsequent impact with the sea floor. Pieces of equipment, fragments of hull plating, personal belongings were strewn across the sediment. Trieste's cameras captured images of the bow section, with the submarine's draft marks still clearly visible on the hull, proof, if any were needed, that this was indeed the Thresher. Among the debris, investigators found small personal items that brought the human cost of the disaster into sharp focus. A shoe, a piece of cloth, a coffee cup, the everyday objects of men who had expected to come home. Robert Eugene Johnson was the chief petty officer and torpedo man on Thresher. He was born in Junction City, Ohio, and raised in Wyandotte, Michigan. He had served on submarines for most of his career, including the Grenadier, the Paddle, the Gar, and the Trout. He was the first man to qualify in the new Thresher class of submarines, a point of pride for a career enlisted sailor. He was 37 years old. Robert Steinel was a sonarman first class from Salisbury, Massachusetts. His hometown would later name a memorial park in his honor. Purvis Robinson Jr. was from Nutley, New Jersey, where a monument now bears his name. Robert D. Kearney was from Denville, New Jersey, remembered at Gardner Field Recreation Area. These were real men with real families, real plans for Easter dinner. The 17 civilians aboard included engineers and technicians from Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, men who had spent months working on Thresher's overhaul and wanted to see their work performed. Richard K. Fisher was a civilian employee of the shipyard's design division. Paul Garrett was another. They were there because they cared about their work, because they wanted to see it through, and that dedication cost them their lives. And then there was Lieutenant Raymond McCool, Thresher's reactor control officer. McCool was what the Navy calls a Mustang, an enlisted man who had risen through the ranks to become an officer. He had served for years as a chief petty officer aboard the USS Nautilus, the first nuclear submarine in history. He knew reactor plants the way a surgeon knows anatomy. He was in or near the engine room when the flooding began. His expertise, his experience, his knowledge of the reactor and its systems would have made him one of the key people trying to manage the crisis in those final minutes. We will never know exactly what McCool did in those last moments, but we know what his training would have demanded. We know what the procedures called for. And we know the kind of man he was. A Mustang doesn't rise from the enlisted ranks to become an officer on a nuclear submarine without possessing extraordinary competence, courage, and dedication to his crew. Whatever actions he took in that flooding engine room, they were the actions of a man fighting for the lives of his shipmates. The aftermath of the Thresher disaster transformed the United States Navy. In December of 1963, just 8 months after the loss, the Navy established the submarine safety program known as SubSafe. It was, and remains, the most rigorous quality assurance program in the history of naval engineering. SubSafe's mandate was simple in concept and revolutionary in execution: provide maximum reasonable assurance of hull integrity to preclude flooding, and of the operability and integrity of critical systems and components to control and recover from a flooding casualty. Every word of that mandate was written in the blood of the Thresher's crew. Under SubSafe, every component of a submarine's hull and seawater systems is tracked from manufacture to installation. Every weld is inspected, tested, and documented. Every pipe joint is evaluated not just visually, but with advanced, non-destructive testing methods. Every maintenance action on critical systems requires certified quality assurance inspectors, detailed documentation, and independent verification. There is no shortcutting. There is no good enough. There is only the standard, and it is met, or the submarine does not go to sea. The ballast blow systems were completely redesigned. The strainers that had frozen on Thresher were replaced with systems that could function reliably under the most extreme conditions. Moisture removal from high-pressure air systems was improved. Testing protocols were established that replicated actual emergency conditions, not theoretical ones. Reactor operating procedures were rewritten. The requirement to immediately isolate the main steam system after a scram was modified to allow crews to use residual steam for emergency propulsion in survival situations. The deadly paradox that had trapped Thresher, where following the correct procedure for reactor safety prevented the crew from saving the submarine, was eliminated. Training was overhauled. Every submarine crew was required to drill extensively on flooding casualties at depth, including scenarios where multiple systems failed simultaneously. The philosophy shifted from assuming that each system would work to preparing for the possibility that none of them would. The results speak for themselves. Since the establishment of SubSafe, not a single SubSafe certified submarine has been lost. The only other American nuclear submarine lost after Thresher was the USS Scorpion, which sank in 1968 with the loss of all 99 crew members. Scorpion was not SubSafe certified. The program works. It has saved countless lives. And every submariner who has served since 1963 owes a debt to the men of the Thresher that can never be fully repaid. But here is what haunts the submarine community. Here is what keeps retired submariners awake at night, decades after the event. Those men in the engine room who sealed the watertight door, they did everything right. They followed the procedures. They made the sacrifice. They chose to die so that their shipmates might live. And it wasn't enough, not because they failed, not because their courage was insufficient, but because the systems around them, the piping, the electrical panels, the ballast blow system, the reactor procedures, had already been compromised by decisions made far from the ocean, in offices and conference rooms where the pressure was schedule pressure, not ocean pressure. The men who sealed that door believed they were saving 118 lives. They believed that by containing the flooding, they were giving the rest of the crew the time and the buoyancy to surface. That's what the manuals said would happen. That's what the training promised. But the manuals hadn't accounted for the ice and the strainers. The training hadn't prepared for a simultaneous loss of propulsion and ballast blow capability. The design hadn't anticipated that the very safety systems meant to protect the reactor would prevent the crew from using the reactor's residual energy to save themselves. The men in that engine room died believing they had saved their shipmates. They didn't know that the 118 men forward were also doomed. They didn't know that the whole ship was going down. They made their choice based on the best information they had, and that choice was heroic, and it was futile. And it was both of those things at the same time. That is the unbearable truth of the Thresher disaster. 60 years later, the USS Thresher has not been decommissioned. She remains on the Navy's rolls, listed as being on eternal patrol. It's a designation given to submarines lost at sea, and it carries a weight of meaning that only submariners fully understand. Eternal patrol means the boat is still out there, still serving, still standing watch. The crew never came home, and so, in a sense, they never stopped working. At the Kittery Memorial Circle in the town of Kittery, Maine, just across the river from Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, a flagpole stands 129 feet tall, 1 foot for each person lost. It was dedicated on April 7th, 2013, the 50th anniversary of the disaster. The flag that flies from it is visible for miles, a constant reminder of the cost of complacency. At Arlington National Cemetery, a commemorative monument was dedicated on September 26, 2019. The families gathered for the ceremony, many of them the children who had waved from car windows that April morning in 1963. They were in their 60s now, gray-haired grandparents. Some had spent their entire lives wondering what had happened to their fathers on that submarine, wondering about the details that were classified for decades, wondering whether the Navy had told them everything. In 2019, retired Captain James Bryant, who had commanded 3 Thresher-class submarines during his career, sued the Navy to force the release of declassified investigation documents. For years, the Navy had resisted Freedom of Information Act requests related to the disaster. Bryant argued that the families deserved to know. A judge agreed. In 2020, an order was issued to declassify 3,600 pages of material, released at a rate of 300 pages per month. The documents confirmed what many had long suspected. There was no single villain, no cover-up, no conspiracy. Just a cascading series of failures, each one individually manageable, but together overwhelming. The silver brazed joints, the frozen strainers, the reactor procedures, the schedule pressure, the inadequate testing, the assumption that because the technology was advanced, it must be safe. It's a pattern we see again and again in disaster. Not malice, not incompetence, but confidence. The confidence that because something has always worked before, it will work again. The confidence that known risks are acceptable because they haven't materialized yet. The confidence that the system, whatever the system is, will catch the errors that individuals miss. The men of the Thresher trusted that system. They trusted their submarine. They trusted the people who built her and maintained her and designed her, and they went to sea believing they were as safe as it was possible to be 1,000 feet below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. They deserved better. Vice Admiral Bruce DeMars, the Navy's chief submarine officer, said it best in 1988, 25 years after the disaster. The loss of Thresher initiated fundamental changes in the way we do business, changes in design, construction, inspections, safety checks, tests, and more. We have not forgotten the lessons learned. It's a much safer submarine force today. That is the legacy of the Thresher. That is what those 129 men gave us, not just their lives. Their deaths gave the submarine force a gift of awareness, an understanding that safety is not a destination, it's a discipline, that quality assurance is not paperwork, it's a moral obligation, that every silver brazed joint, every pipe weld, every strainer, every valve carries the weight of human lives and must be treated accordingly. The men in that engine room, the ones who sealed the door, they couldn't save their shipmates, but in a way that is almost too painful to articulate, their sacrifice and the sacrifice of everyone aboard the Thresher saved generations of submariners who came after them. Every submarine crew that has returned safely to port since 1963 has the men of the Thresher to thank. Every family that has welcomed a submariner home, hugged them on the pier, has the Thresher to thank. 129 lives, 16 officers, 96 enlisted men, 17 civilians, fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, friends. They went to sea on a Tuesday morning in April with Easter just days away, expecting to come home by Thursday. They never did, but they changed the world beneath the waves forever. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, at the Albacore Park, there's a stone memorial with a plaque that bears the names of all 129. If you visit, you'll notice that people still leave flowers there, still leave coins on the memorial, still pause and read the names and stand in silence. At Groton, Connecticut, home port of the Thresher, an enlisted barracks at Naval Submarine Base, New London, bears the name Thresher Hall. In the lobby, a plaque lists every name, every rank, every rate, every person, every life. And at naval bases across the country, every April 10th, submariners gather. They stand in formation, they lower the flag, they read the names aloud, one by one, each name followed by a moment of silence. It takes a long time. 129 names take a long time to read. When they reach the last name, they raise the flag back to full staff, and they return to their boats, to their watches, to the deep water, because that's what submariners do. They go back to sea. They go back to sea because the men of the Thresher showed them what that commitment truly means. Not just the willingness to serve in submarines, but the willingness to serve knowing that the ocean will never forgive a mistake, that the margin between survival and disaster is measured in pipe joints and strainer meshes, and the fractions of seconds it takes to close a watertight door. The man who sealed that door in the engine room of the USS Thresher didn't know he was changing history. He didn't know that his act would echo through 6 decades of submarine operations. He didn't know that his sacrifice would save thousands of lives through the sub-safe program that was born from his death. He only knew one thing, that 118 of his shipmates were on the other side of that door, and that closing it was the only thing he could do to give them a chance. It wasn't enough. But it was everything. And that is the story of the USS Thresher. Remember to like this video if it moved you. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. And share it with someone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people, doing their duty in extraordinary circumstances, can change the world. The USS Thresher is on eternal patrol. Her crew stands their watch. And we, all of us, are the beneficiaries of the lessons paid for with their lives. April 10th, 1963, 9:18 a.m. and 24 seconds, 220 miles east of Cape Cod. Depth, 2,400 feet, 1/10 of a second, 129 souls. Silence.